Hi, and welcome back. We have with us today Amanda Cox, the executive editor for data journalism at Bloomberg News. I first met Amanda at the New York Times, where she was editor of The Upshot, the groundbreaking Times venture into using sophisticated data visualizations to illuminate complex issues. She has been an important force in raising the bar for the use of data in telling all kinds of stories, and we're very glad to be able to have her with us today. Amanda, thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Amanda, there's so many interesting things we can go over with you, but we want to focus on two things today. The first is what Barbara likes to call interrogating the data, and the second is how to find stories in data sets. So let's start with interrogating the data. What are some basic things you want to know about a data set when you first get to meet it?
Sure. I think there's some standard intro questions no matter where the data comes from. And to me, in my head, one of the most basic ones is like, where does it come from and what does it measure? If I can share my screen, I brought one example of that I think, makes it a little bit more memorable, that kind of idea. This is an example from a data journalist in Minnesota. Oops, it's not what I wanted. And what he is showing in this map or what it purports to be, is residential water use per capita. So how much water does every person use? But if you look at the map and what he's saying here is like, this map looks kind of funny, right? Do I really think that the border between Illinois and Wisconsin, are people who live on different sides of that border so different? It could be. Sometimes people are different in different states. States have different tax policies, but people are people too. So it's pretty weird the number of borders that you can see if you just look at this map. And the answer is probably more, this map doesn't actually measure what you think it's trying to measure, right? Probably there's some modeling going on here within states. Maybe some of these states actually count business water use too or something, right? So when you're looking at a data set, there are certain things you can do to just look at it and be like, that looks kind of weird. The other thing I tell people when they're doing this stuff is you don't have to think of data reporting as completely different from word reporting either. So what do you know, when do you start to trust something and if you're, reporting off of humans? One of the very basic things is I want 2 or 3 different sources, or I want one document and one human source or something. And so if we stay even within the map world, I brought an example of that too. So here's a map early in the coronavirus pandemic. We wanted to know the question of who's left New York City? By neighborhood or by zip code, I think this is maybe smaller than that, tract or something. Who is gone? How this was measured, this was from a company analyzing cell phone data, right? But that data, it comes from a kind of a sketchy place. It comes from people who have agreed to put apps on their phone that transmit data to someone. So that's not going to be representative of everyone. Similarly, there's even in the question as simple as this, there's hard questions how do you know where home is for people? Well, what they do is they say where did you sleep 5 of the 7 nights last week? That's probably your home. And that works, well enough, but there's some assumptions baked into that. And so that's the kind of question where you get this data, it shows a pattern, clearly in Manhattan, more people had left, half of the people in some of these neighborhoods in Manhattan were gone. And that kind of makes sense, but we don't know if it's right or not. And so one thing you can do with data in terms of asking it is how does it line up with different ways to answer that question? And so here's an example of 3 different types of data. So one of these is people who have installed some things on their app. One of them is people who are pinging off of a cell phone tower. And the lesson I like from this example, and it often happens with these kind of things, is if you just line up different sources of data, they all kind of say the same thing, right? In here, did 18.6% of people leave Manhattan, or 13.7, or 12.9? It's probably none of those actually. But you get the gist and you see the patterns. And those are the kind of questions I think you want to ask when you're starting with data is how is it different from other sources of the same thing? Do the patterns kind of line up with stuff we know about like income or expect? If we did this exercise on just a normal weekday, not coronavirus, would it show that no one was leaving? That's what you want it to show. And so, but again, these are the same kind of questions that we were asking or thinking to ask with that water data, which was like, where does it come from? What are we trying to measure? And what are the flaws on that? Because, it's never going to be perfect, but as long as the flaws kind of overlap each other, that's sort of okay. And so, and there's more basic questions too. Do the totals, in some data sets you have totals. So like, do the totals in your data set match the totals that you're trying to get to?
So it's like, I think for a lot of reporters and for me, that numbers can be intimidating and you just assume that they're right because it's data. But you're sort of saying, use the same that you do with everything else, and try to look for confirmation, just the way you would if you got a political tip, you'd want to have another source confirm it. If you're able to have another source confirm your data, or give you just a ballpark, it might not be exactly this, but you're in the ballpark, as opposed to there's something very wrong here.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. The same ideas about confirmation, the same ideas about what kind of precision are you going for? Are you going for East Village seems harder, or are you going for 18.62%? And some data sets have a good enough for some types of precision, and other data sets are good enough for kinda. This is the idea of the scale of this thing.
Amanda, what advice do you have for journalists who are working in breaking news or enterprise stories, and they're trying to find data to fit a story, to tell the story best, or to find angles to tell the story?
Yeah, I think, again, I would claim that it's not so different from any other type of reporting, right? Like, if you don't know what you are doing, you want to find some people who can tell you more and learn to ask experts good questions and learn to ask experts about, like, who else should I talk to, or who has data on this, or what are the problems with looking at something that, if in the case where you don't feel like you're a little over your skis, you don't know enough to know, like, why is this data set better for this versus this data set? If it's a hard question. If it's an easy question, like that there's certain types of questions that people just agree on a source for too, right? Like, if you want to know the population of a town, we just trust census data. And there's variants of that. You can trust, the decennial census, the ACS, whatever. But again, those are kind of the questions that, like, it's all basically going to be the same answer. But I would say, one of the best things you can do if you're like, I have a hole in my story, and that hole is probably, you should think about, what am I trying to do with this hole? Like, probably you're trying to say something about scale of something, or you're trying to put something in context to say, like, oh, this problem is bigger in this area than this area, or something like that. And so you want to start to get a handle on how are those things measured on whatever you're reporting. What are the problems of, what are the different ways people measure it, and I think talking to people, like, and just asking them those questions, you start to get a handle on, like, what are my options here.
That's great advice, and find experts early is a good way to make sure you have data you need. Sorry.
Yeah.
We've talked about looking at a specific set of data to when you have a purpose in mind, but other times you just like find some data and and wonder what's in there, what stories are locked up in that book, and how can I just start from scratch and come up with a bunch of ideas, like to test out on the data, or to test out with my editor to see if what is possible and what is interesting overlap in that data. So I was wondering if you could just walk us through an example or just the way you think about doing that.
Sure. I brought an example from Bloomberg that well predates my time at Bloomberg. I've only been here about a year, and this one's like 7 or 8 years old now. But I think it speaks to this question well about, like, data can unlock things that you didn't even know were possible when you went in. And so the story behind this one is one of my colleagues, David Ingold, received a question from the Amazon reporter, someone who covers Amazon as a beat. And at that time, his question was like, how many Americans can have same-day shipping from Amazon? Pretty basic question. There was a form on Amazon's website at that time where you could type in your zip code and it would just say, yes or no, right? Like yes, you can have free same-day shipping, or it's available in your area, or no, it's not. And so what David did is he said, like, okay, so there's only 30,000 or something zip codes in the U.S. And so some of the power of data is to do things at scale. So you and I, we could fill in this form once. We could also teach our computer to fill it in 30,000 times and just have data for every single zip code. So that's what David did. So he got, he just filled in this form 30,000 different times. And they got an answer, right? 77.6 million Americans live in zip codes where Amazon offers Prime free same-day delivery. Fine. It's the answer to their question. That's the question they started out with. So a little more complicated than that. Like, first he gets the answer for every zip code, then he joins that to census data. I think that's an important thing to think of about, like, if you're going to start to do cool stuff with data, it's very rare that all the cool stuff is going to come in one data set at once. Like, often you're going to have to, like, join a couple together or think about what would happen if I, enhance this data with something like that. Same way with words, right? It's very rare your favorite story is a single source story. Sometimes, maybe, but often, like, the good stuff comes from, like, triangulating a little bit or putting stuff together. So they made this map, but now that they've gathered this data, the question is this resolution actually the interesting resolution in this data? So here's a map that just says, like, basically cities in America have free same-day delivery at that time.
By resolution, you mean what scale to present the data at? If you're looking at a zip code or state or something?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, here it's very zoomed out. It's like, let's look at the whole U.S. at the whole, like, not a ton of detail in this. But if you zoom in a little bit, the patterns start to get a little bit more interesting, right? So even if you've never been to Boston, you know nothing about where people live in Boston, you can say, Boston has, so here on these maps, the blue area is the places that get same-day delivery, and the gray area is the places that don't, just for these cities. So this is this, basically the same data that we were looking at on the previous screen, just zoomed in, higher resolution in the words that I was using. So, you look at Boston, the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, it's a hole in the middle of Boston. So you might say, that's a puzzle. Like, it's not that deep of a puzzle if you know much about the demographics of Boston, or same with, like, okay, so Chicago, everywhere in Chicago has it except the South Side and the area below the South Side. So now, we've joined this to census data, so we also have demographics available to us. And so you can say, let's look at Boston and let's try to understand more about that hole in the middle of Boston. And so you can look at something and say, like, okay, basically, not a ton of white people live there. I think the population of Roxbury at the time was like 15 or 16% white, something like that. And that's where, it's a predominantly Black neighborhood in Boston. So, not shocking, but, like, these patterns in that you see in the data, they start to have, like, they start to have a little bit more information behind them. Or same exercise in Chicago, where you can look at the totals and say, like, okay, in Chicago, 98% of the white people that live in Chicago have same-day shipping available to them, and only 54% of the Black people do. So there's some gap there. There's some difference. And we like this story because, in part, it published, I think, in late April of some year, and a few days later, Amazon agrees to expand same-day shipping in Boston. A few days after that, it expands same-day shipping in New York. A few days after that, it expands same-day shipping in Chicago. In part, I thought of this example, or it was a good example for, like, where this wasn't the story they started with, right? They started with a much simpler story that was just get me to a big number, 77.6 million, like one number, not, is that a lot? Is that a little? I don't know. We like this story because, it actually had some impact, right? Like right after the story, Amazon changed some policies, and maybe the policies were right before for business choices, but once this data became public, once these patterns became public, something about those business practices practices changed. I also think this is a good one because I think the stories that you're looking for are or that I feel like are the most fun ones are you're trying to solve little puzzles with data, right? And you're trying to get data to tell you stuff that someone wouldn't tell you if you just called them, right? If you called up Amazon and said hey, can you tell me about the patterns in your free same-day shipping? Then they might say something it's available in select areas, to cities, or whatever, right? Looking at the data all of a sudden lets you ask a better question. Instead you can say hey, why does the Black neighborhood in Boston, in the middle of Boston, not have access to free same-day shipping? And there could be great reasons for that. There could be good business reasons, but having that data behind you lets you be a better interviewer and ask better questions, just because you could look for better patterns than you could when you started. So that was an example where it just didn't start out as a story about race at all. It started out as a story about a big number. Then you looked at that pattern and said what could explain some of these patterns in some of these cities? There appeared to be associated with race, and then it became a race story. So part of it is just looking at what are the outliers in the data that you want to explain or you want to know more about? Where are things different? And that can lead to better stories, right? I think this story, this action doesn't come out of a story that says 70 whatever million people have access to same-day shipping, right? Impact comes out of stories that look for patterns and try to solve puzzles.
That's applying the nose for news to the statistics. I mean, that you listen to it, you play around with it, and something strikes you as interesting, and you go in that direction, and are willing to be flexible about finding out what the story is rather than going in supposing what the story is.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Once you get that data too, it's receipts to expose those unjust patterns that we didn't know existed. And were affecting our lives. So I really love this story. It's a great example. If you wanted to add anything to that, please go ahead. And I have another question to jump off of.
No, I agree with that entirely. I'm happy to hear more.
Yeah, my question to you would be to consider beat reporters and maybe either topic beat reporters or local beat reporters in a neighborhood or community. What sort of go-to resources for data would you recommend that they monitor or that they just know about and go to in order to look at, maybe consider some of these patterns that they might not recognize, but, once they start incorporating experts and maybe combining data, that they might be revealed. So what are the best sources, do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, I think the best sources are really going to depend and vary based on your beat, based on your community. There are people who are good at this stuff, right? Depending on communities, right? There are people who are super into open data portals for certain types of cities, and some cities are better than the others. There's this most basic kind of stuff, sort of census data is something that I think it probably is good for at least every beginning reporter to at least wrap their head around, to know that number of houses is not so hard in my community, or here's where if you're covering education, here's where I can understand test scores, or if you're covering some sort of company that has any regulation behind it, here's everything I can learn about them at the SEC, right? I think it's any of those kinds of government data is probably the easiest and most basic and thing that scales the most. And most basic's the wrong word, but government data is the thing that scales the most across the country and is going to be available in the most places and down to the smallest level of geographies. So starting to understand that, starting to understand also just thinking about the basic question of where do these numbers come from, right? And anytime a company or a community or a politician releases a number, like it comes from somewhere, right? Probably it's not, that number did not just come out of thin air, or then you have a different story to write. But that thinking about like, okay, how do I what's the source for that? Like, and what other variation is possible in that data, or how does that data break down by things that like were not relevant for this, but might be relevant sometime in the future.
Terrific. Thank you.
It just strikes me, we all like to be super original, but it's also useful that if someone sees a story like what you did with Amazon, they can ask that question of their community. And you see a census story that indicates that there's a lot of good to be done by just building on the work of others rather than just saying, no, I can't do that because somebody else did it. Your readers don't know. Your readers will like to learn what they can. So, and because, as you say, government stuff is so universal and also goes to different scales, it means you can replicate in different settings.
Yep, or at least start to have the basic backbone for replicating and then joining it to something that's unique to your own community, right? Like, so at least the first part is easy. And then the maybe the cooler part comes from, it's a policy about a road that you don't know where the money's coming from, or, right? Like the harder part is never, like the really, truly hard parts are not going to scale as well, but some of the kind of core stuff will.
And that also gets to it's you can think of it as data journalism, or you can think of it as journalism that's using data among its other tools. As you say, to combine talking to experts, talking to people, going out in the street and seeing what things look like, along with just being at the computer. Well, these are really both great examples of interesting things, important things people can do with data, and some specific lessons there. And it's going to be really useful for our students, I think. I want to thank you very much. Barbara, anything else you want to add?
No, just thanks so much, Amanda, and nice to meet you. Been
nice to meet you.
Your work.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And we look forward to your next project. So
awesome.
Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.